Good morning and Happy New Year. I hope it's been a good one for everybody so far. We dodged another snowstorm last night. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Virginia Transit Association's webinar on the Transit Equity Toolkit. I'm Lisa Guthrie. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Transit Association, and we're glad that you can join us today. We're recording this webinar and it will be available on our website along with the slides for on-demand viewing. We'll save all questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar after all panelists have presented. And please go ahead and enter them into the chat box throughout the presentation and we'll address them at the appropriate time. We'll be conducting a live poll with several questions for you at various points along the presentation. Your responses will be grouped with all others and will be anonymous. The compiled responses will appear almost instantaneously. This will inform all of us as to where we are in our equity progression. I'm happy to introduce our equity consultant and presenter today, Dr. Sydney Fawcett. Sid and I worked together many moons ago in Virginia Beach Public Schools, and since then he has founded and owned a charter school management organization and served as a mentor and coach to leaders in Michigan and Virginia. His career has led him to taking a stand for racial equity, and he's currently working to establish a multiracial church in Southampton County. Sid has a long history and deep respect for bus operators and their community impact. We've been fortunate to have Sid work with us in developing this toolkit, and he welcomes this opportunity to speak to you today about equity in public transportation. I also want to thank Danny Plogger, VTA's Deputy Director, who's serving as our webmaster and technical advisor today. And to get us started, let me roll back about a year ago. The COVID-19 pandemic and the racial and social justice movements of 2020 elevated the racial and cultural disparities in all segments of society, even in public transportation. When commuting to a workplace came to mean for many, moving a few steps to your bedroom office instead of driving or taking the train miles away, it magnified the importance of local essential travel for frontline workers. The needs for adequate bus shelters and targeted access became even more apparent. The elimination of fares meant that low-income riders could instead apply the savings on housing, food, and childcare. In the 2020 General Assembly session, Delegate Dolores McQuinn of Richmond introduced House Joint Resolution 542 that directs DRPT, that's the Virginia Department of Public Transportation, to conduct a 2-year study with the cooperation of all transit agencies that emphasizes transit services and engagement opportunities for the underserved and underrepresented communities. That study will be completed in August and will hopefully launch some new statewide initiatives. And for more on that study, please visit the website vatransitequity.com. VTA was pleased to see that official advancement on the issue of equity, but we wanted to move forward in developing a toolkit that will assist all transit providers with some resources as they establish their own equity policies and procedures. I want to take a moment to thank the members of the VTA Equity Advisory Core Group that met every month to review, discuss, and recommend the content of the toolkit and how it might be helpful to colleagues across Virginia. Those core group members are William Harrell of Hampton Roads Transit, Jamie Jackson of Fred in Fredericksburg, Bob Schneider, OmniRide, Julie Tim, GRTC, Von Tisdale, Ride Finders, Garland Williams of CAT, and Grant Sparks and Andy Wright of DRPT. Well, I want to thank each of them for kicking this off and putting in a lot of thought and time into this project. One of the things that we tackled early on was our definition of equity, and there's probably as many variations on the definition as there are participants, so we've included several in our toolkit outline. There's also a glossary of terms that spell out the nuances of current usages. We want you to be comfortable with the concept of equity and not be afraid to talk about it or address the needs that exist in your organization or in your community. And if you can go to the next slide, Danny, we'll look at the table of contents. We go on to sections on human resources, policies, practices, and procedures, community needs, strategic planning and communications, including graphics and social media templates. The whole purpose of this online toolkit is to logically lay out resources for you to have at your fingertips. That's it. There's no accountability or report due. And we have scoured resources for many educational, organizational, and business professionals to share with you what you don't have time to assemble. This is just a start. We'd like to update the links in the toolkit going forward, so this is a living and breathing tool. And we hope you'll find it beneficial and will use it. So with that, it's with my great pleasure that I now turn the webinar over to Sid to start us off. Welcome.
Good. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for the introduction. One point I want to make that's just a simple, quick point, is that once you get the toolkit, the links you see in blue, you can just hit the link and the article will come up. It's something that will be live for you to see. When I look at transit and the work that I've done with the Virginia Transit Association, one quick conclusion really was that public transit in Virginia is an essential service. The number one reason is probably not what the transit operators want to hear, but it's for the economy. You've got to get the workers to work. It's a real simple process. Also politically, when we look at equity, I want to make a point that I think every time I read about it, it gets pushed back a little bit. So I don't want to put a date on it, but it was like 3 years ago with some work I was doing on equity with the University of Michigan, that the date 2025 was the big year that pluralism would happen in America, and this would no longer be a white majority. And I think we see that a lot with what's going on in equity, with the power struggle, without even getting into everything that propelled off of George Floyd. But also, when I look at equity and I look at what you're doing in transit, I look at your board. Aside of the essential service that I've tried to pretty up for you, I'll call it that, and getting people out in the communities to see it as an essential service. And this may be a discomfort spot, play off of emotions. You know, I know personally that if I were going to go out and I was going to do that, I would go to churches. I would involve children. As a matter of fact, I was thinking last night and I jotted it down. I thought I mentioned today, since if Lisa had mentioned we worked at Virginia Beach Public Schools, I wouldn't throw this in. But a piece of school bus wisdom I would give you is that, did you ever notice why school buses are essential in public education? It's really no different than in public transit. The reason, unfortunately, is not education. Lisa knows Don Ball, old professor of mine at University of Virginia, who's now passed away. Don would always remind me that the main purpose of schools was childcare. And that's where the busing thing comes in. And I've just been reading, and I don't know if you read Diversity Inc. or not, we're going to mention that later today, but a new policy that's rising up in America, in case you haven't heard of it, I thought I pointed out to you today, is called Infants at Work. Policy up and coming in business, which is like, I kind of laughed when I read the article on Diversity Inc. because I remember when they were first letting dogs come to work with everybody, they were so worried about what the dogs were going to do. Now they're talking about, and there are companies that have already begun the process allowing infants at work. I share that with you just simply because it's a part of transit being an essential service. Lisa's going to talk later today about civic engagement and political mapping, and I encourage you to really take a look at that. As we put this toolkit together, one of the things that quickly became apparent was it was going to be a racial equity kit. It really deals a great deal with race. Although, as I walk through this today, I want to talk about race, I want to talk about diversity, I want to talk about all these other issues, but you're going to find I'm going to add into it a whole bunch of other people that fit into equity. One of the things that just, you know, kind of grips me as I work through all of this is, and VTA, I know, works hard at this just because I know Lisa well in our conversations, but it's really like an absolute need for one voice on all issues related to public transit or public transportation. And to say it in a way that I don't mean to be negative, but when people out in different agencies try to speak for self-interest and not for the best interest of public transit, it just fractures the whole public and legislative support. So I know I'm not supposed to say that, but Lisa would expect me to say something inappropriate. So to me, public transportation is an essential and it's a civil right. And I'm going to use a quote out of Modus blog, if you're familiar with that or not, but it says, being transportation vulnerable is shortening the lifespan for marginalized people for as many as 10 years and as a primary barrier to escaping poverty. If you hear something, that's my doorbell ringing. So I simply share that with you. But when you look at the report, the toolkit, you'll notice that in it, and Lisa's earlier comments was about the Equity Glossary. If and when you look at the Equity Glossary, you will see that our primary list started with one Virginia, but we also included the Pacific University Oregon lengthy list. A term I became familiar with in my early years in grad school was slights and indignities, which then got classed up to be called microaggressions. So in addition to the Equity Glossary, I would encourage you to get really familiar with microaggressions, because to many people, what happens in microaggressions are considered racial slurs. And to say this in a little crude way, ignorance isn't an excuse when you're in a leadership role or when you're working with people to deal with issues of equity. Personally, I like the term slights and indignities better than microaggressions because I think most people understand what that is. When you jump over to the section here on regulations and programs, the human resources links and all in here, I immediately think of what I call the golden rule, and that is he who has a goal makes the rules. And I think that's one of the probably difficult places I have is that FTA and USDOT and everyone else, through regulations and through the flow of money, just creates a framework of policies that may not, quite frankly, be equity based. And we'll talk a little later about equity lens. And I think a challenge that we have, as well as the opportunity, is to look beyond the regulations and the programs and try to figure out ways to get these things where they're equity sensitive. You know, an example would be, you know, if policies and programs are established through FDA, USDOT, DRPT, via funding, you know, how much flexibility in practice do you have? But the question I pose to you, and I'm not going to quote percentages that came from the DRPT report that were reported back in September at the conference, but, you know, do you have an equity statement? Why or why not? My personal opinion, and I'll touch on this a little bit later again, is that if you don't have an equity statement, what is the message that you're sending to your employees, to your community? Gallup, the Gallup organization, talks very openly when it comes to policies and practices and procedures that the role of the supervisor is critical. That we can talk about who the manager of the agency is, but it's who do the employees report to is the person who really determines what people's attitudes are. For equity resolutions, you know, we've used the GARE, G-A-R-E, the Governmental Alliance on Race and Equity. We've used their materials a great deal. I'd also point out to you that when Alexandria came out really strong on it with their resolution, if you really study their resolution and you've read and studied the GARE documents, you'll find a great deal of the content right there. But I would simply say to you, I'll use some caveat on you. First things first, and that is you need a personal equity statement if you're in a leadership role or a supervisory role for that matter. You need an executive team statement and you need a board statement. If you look over it actually at the end document on resources, you'll see that we included the National League of Cities process, which I personally have a bias toward. So I would just simply say to you that I would encourage you to take a look at that. Now just jump to the next one, which is a picture of equity.
Okay, before we do that, Sid, let's do the next poll question. Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yep.
Okay. All right, Danny, this is our first set of questions for our participants here. If you can pull that up, and hopefully it will compute. So we'll give you a few minutes to fill this out. Number one, has your agency reviewed policies for transit equity? Select yes or no. Who do you rely upon for policy compliance? Your attorney, staff compliance officer, independent compliance advisor, other, none of the above. This will help all of you see where you kind of come in related to your colleagues. Okay. Danny, I can't see the responses, so hopefully you can. Yeah.
I can, yes.
Okay.
We'll give it about 10 more seconds. Please answer if you have not done so already. All right, we're closing it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, thank you.
And here are the results.
Okay.
So 64% do have a policy for transit equity, and the vast majority have a staff compliance office.
Okay. Okay. All right, thank you. All right, Sid, let's move to the equity picture.
Okay. I asked for this equity picture to be included because the one with them trying to get apples on the tree or riding the bikes or looking at the ball game, standing on top of boxes are the three that seem to be out there all the time. And the one that I personally think really speaks to equity is the one where it shows them watching a ball game with where they put a fence in. And the reason that I like using that, and I think this will come out as we go forward, is the simple fact that when you put the fence in, so the short guy is not standing on a box, it systematically removes the barrier. Everything else just simply creates some means by which everyone is treated equitably. But to me, the real dealing with equity, whether it's your policies, practices, or procedures, is that you systematically deal with it. And doing that, I'm going to use from Equity City a simple definition of racial equity. And they say it's the fair, just distribution of resources, explicitly targeting and prioritizing racial groups who have the greatest need due to being systematically, notice the word systematically, disenfranchised and using these resources to address both historical and contemporary injustices and their consequential burdens. The term that's used a great deal when we look at racial equity, or we look at equity in general, is the term marginalized. The other terms that I hear constantly are let's do it for the underserved or the underrepresented. The term I like to talk about is let's have the conversation with the unserved, the people who simply don't get service. The central transit question to me, without putting it in a racial context, a racial equity context, is to simply ask the question, what do you do for middle and upper class people that you don't do for everyone else? Or you could say, what services do you provide, rather than saying, what do you do? But I think the services also include everything from walking distance to time of day to working hours and all those things. So without belaboring that, I asked Danny to include the slide that shows a Maryland set of 10 questions. And you can see that over on the right bottom. And I had wanted to compare and work with the idea of the Minnesota list of questions, but believe it or not, between the time that I had studied the Minnesota questions and the Maryland questions side by side, Minnesota took theirs down. So I don't have a copy of that to share with you, and it's not in the resources that we included for that reason. But the reason that I wanted to show that, and the reason that I chose the Maryland one, to be quite honest with you, is that I think there is a great fear among people of carrying out the equity questions. And I felt like the Maryland questions were about the least threatening group that I could find anywhere that also got at what needs to be done. But if you were to look at the Minnesota group, you would see that it's starting to get a little bit more into the whole notion of what's systemic. On the next slide, I'm just going to keep rolling along here. On the next slide, this is just a definition that's kind of broad, kind of general, but it talks about an equity tool is a tool for analysis to analyze the internal, external, and foundational elements of policies or programs on underserved, marginalized, and diverse individuals and groups to identify appropriate accommodation, eliminate barriers and inequities. And it goes on to say, and I included this because we're going to talk about DEI, particularly with belonging, to evaluate interpersonal engagement and how well people work effectively with people who are different from themselves. So it's really, and a conversation Lisa and I have had often is our goal, and what we provided to you is that you not just have the temporary equity lens where you get a perspective on what's going on, to where you go to an equity framework where you create a transformative perspective. An example of that I took a look at, that it actually comes from a guy named John Paul Lederach's The Little Book of Conflict Transformation. But there it gets into the idea of resolution perspective, where you have, and I'm just going to give a couple of examples just to try to show you, to go from the resolution perspective to the transformative perspective. And like the key question is, and maybe I'll just use that one today, the resolution perspective key question is, how do we end something not desired? The transformative perspective is how to end something destructive and build something desired. I think real often with the equity lens, we look at how do we end something not desired, but we don't look at it from the transformative perspective, which also I might add, if you look at that question, on the resolution side is content centered, on the transformative side is relationship centered. And I just share that with you because all of this ends up being about people. Also on the resolution side, it's just short term. On the transformative side is long range. I'd love to sit and take hours with this, but I'm not. But I just want to point out to you that when you look at this, to try to go beyond the simple, and I give you one that's real simple because this is tied to human resources, is when you look at job posts, what's the language that's there? When you look at your interview questions, when you talk about, I've heard so many times in my career, people talk about, does a person fit? Does it mean they agree or their need? You know, one of the findings that I'll touch on quickly later is that if you want to get a woman to accept a job, usually you have a woman on the interview team. I think you'll also find out when someone comes in that's a minority in your business, that if you have someone of the same as a person interviewing, that they're more likely to take a job. So I just simply point those out in the whole notion of trying to move forward. I shared with you a slide because I want to make a simple point from Akita Wilbot. That'd be the next slide, Danny. And I shared this with you, and I know this is a place where people squirm a little bit in their seats, but I don't mind the squirming and don't mind having you get mad at me for that reason. But if you'll notice, the third item that Makita Wilbon has, and what she calls her equity lens framework, is seeing white. And I'm going to be, excuse me, I don't know why I'm losing my voice. Excuse me, but if you read that, you simply see, you recognize, I'm sorry, Lisa, you recognize the specific elements that inform the racial identity and actions of white people. And I'm not trying to be judgmental, so please don't anyone get upset with me if possible. But when you go back and you read federal law, you read state law, what lens is it seen through? Is it seen through an equity lens? And I'm not going to try to be judgmental about it. I'll let you answer that question for you, because many of you, most of you, are more familiar with the regulations than I am. But if you look at just simply the 6 items that Makita Wilbon lists, centering race, and she wants to go beyond, diversity to all the different areas. I won't mention that. Ensuring access. Those of you in a leadership role, and those of you that work as consultants, you're gatekeepers to ensuring access to different people. Seeing white, centering relationships. I'm going to talk a lot about that today. Building bridges. We're going to talk a little later today about ERGs and their relation to empathy, cooperation, trust, effective communication, etc. And shifting and sharing power. And I'm going to tell you, folks, that's a hard one in the world that we live in today. And I'm going to add this, and probably regret I did. Look at what's going on in our nation and our state politically, as we talk about shifts in power as stakeholders and that type thing. So I share those with you because I think it gets simply at, and this is from the Annie Casey Foundation, where it simply says sequent equity does not mean taking a slice of someone's pie, because that breeds resentment that aligns with zero-sum thinking. Equity means giving everyone access to essential ingredients and skills to bake their own pie. And I know that's kind of an odd way to put it, but I share it with you because it makes it pretty simple. An article that I want to make sure that I point out to you that's on the list of resources when you get that document in hand comes from a man named David A. Thomas. It's in a Harvard Business Review article called Race Matters. And I share that document with you because I think it's a must reading if you're in a leadership role. It's an old document. I believe it was written back in 2002. So it's 19 years old, but as I read leadership materials and work with mentoring and coaching, David, this article comes up more than anything. And I'm going to make it real simple and point out to you, hoping that you'll go read the article. As I said, it's in what we have, they talk about the exodus of minority professionals from middle management, where they leave, they get frustrated, they get angry, and they go to better careers with your competitors. And David Thomas talks about the exodus as being a 2-tournament system. And the 2-tournament system is, in a study, shows that whites tend to fast track early, minorities after years of middle management. And the point, and the reason that I bring this into the HR is that if we want to have real equity and we want to make sure we have equitable practices, we need to make certain that people who have interest in moving toward management, middle management, what I prefer to call leadership, is they need mentors and they need coaches, and organizations need to do that. As a matter of fact, one of the benefits, if you want to take an odd approach to this, one of the benefits of the slow movement of minorities is that when they're in stage 2, where white candidates already jumped into some type of role, to some upper management, we'll call it upper middle management, The minority candidates have created mentors that strengthen them for what lies ahead in their career, whereas the white candidates haven't. So I just simply share with you the importance of this article if you're really looking at how to grow your own and you're looking at mentors and that type thing. And I think it's a critical element to equity. So I just leave that there and hope that you'll read that article if you're in a leadership role. I also would add, if you're in a consulting business, I would encourage you to take a look at that. I want to jump on to the next slide, which is out of Gallup.
Well, the next slide is the questions.
Yep.
Second set of questions. This one is pertaining to your agency on your HR. Number one, does your agency have an internal staff advisory group? Number two, indicate whether it's open to all employees. Give it a few more seconds.
Okay, we'll be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 52% do not have an internal advisory group, and of the 48% that do, 41% are open to all employees, with the vast majority not sure.
Okay. Well, that's instructive when we get to starting about how to kickstart ERGs if you're interested in that. Okay, Sid, Gallup.
Yep, good. Let's look at that slide, the simple slide here. We're just going to leave this up for what'll seem like a long time. But the point of using this slide is to just step back and look at, and most of you are familiar with the Gallup organization, I think, and they say they've identified 3 requirements for creating inclusive environments for all employees. And actually, I think you look at these and say, oh, duh. You know, employees are treated with respect. Employees are valued for their strengths. Leaders do what is right. Now, I want you to know that I have a great bias toward number 2. I believe number 1 and number 3, but I'm just saying number 2, and that's the one that I'll probably talk about a little bit more than you want to hear as I roll forward with it. I'm going to give a few of my opinions. If you ever went to University of Virginia, you would know they would tell you opinion is the lowest form of knowledge. So just I'll give you the lowest form of knowledge now. Well, that's what they told me every class I took. So I think the question when I look at Gallup's work, I look at all of the different kids from Garrett to whomever, is why do people fear talking about race? But one of the things that I noticed, let's say going back 5 years, you could put 3 years on it, I think, and I'd be comfortable. In the old conversation, as I call it, we talked about DEI. DEI was diversity, equality, and inclusion. But as Lisa talked about, and I'm going to use the George Floyd incident as the catalyst here, the conversation started to evolve, and now the conversation is about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but actually the conversation has morphed itself. People use the word inclusion, but they're actually talking about belonging. And Gallup talks a great deal about belongingness. We talk often in human resources, we talk often with inclusive environments that, and I hate saying this, but I've heard this so many times in my career, is people talk about fit. And typically when someone talks about fit, my mind says, does that mean it's like you, which means it's homogeneous and it's groupthink. And I'll just simply say to you, if you don't know what groupthink is, that's another conversation for another day. But in the simplest world, that's where you bring people around you that you're pretty sure agree with what you think. And what you get as your decision is the lowest common denominator, meaning it's just what everybody agrees on and nothing is controversial and nothing moves forward. Or does it meet the needs that you have? And the needs that you have is a diversity of individuals with unique experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives. Now, some of what I'm going to use here is not in the Gallup article, and some of it is. But Gallup found substantial increases in innovation revenues with proportion of female managers is more than 20%. McKinsey, which I'm a big McKinsey reader. If you're not familiar with McKinsey, I hope that you will be. McKinsey found top racially diverse tech companies are 35% more likely to have financial returns higher than the tech sector's national median, and more gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to outperform others. Now, I use McKinsey to introduce a name to you in case you're not familiar with them as a consulting group. They're certainly one of the key groups internationally, not just nationally. Then a group that we hear about a lot, and Kramer talks about them often, is Salesforce. If you look at what Mark Benioff has done to focus on diversity on his board and on pay equity, and I will be quite frank with you, pay equity, meaning equal pay for women to what men get paid, is one of my number one pet peeves, because I've never believed that women should be paid less than what men are paid. But there are people that would like to take me out to the woodshed for that one. But what I want to say is that if you're going to create an inclusive workplace, I don't care whether you're an employee, a team, a manager, or an organizational leader, you must be intent. And diversity comes in many forms. And typically we look at the traditional forms, let's say, of diversity, is gender, racial, and ethnic diversity, and which is visible. When you walk in a room, you see it. You don't have to think, you just see it. But remember, in 2025 plus, it's no longer going to be a white majority nation. So the issue of equality and equity becomes great. And if you have more up-to-date data, I hope you'll put it down in the chat room and get me straight. But other kinds of equity, or really I should say other kinds of diversity that we need to look at in the equity, is educational background. That is so powerful with so many people. They want somebody from Harvard or Yale rather than someone from Howard or Hampton, which are fabulous universities. Geography, economics, family status, disability, that's a big one, people. Sexual preference, today's world, gender expression, identity. If you're in conversations I seem to be in lately, or things I read, political inclination. There's a big issue now with equity and how we deal with it. Religious affiliation, age, neurodiversity. I put that one in because when you get a team of people together, you may connect the dots differently than I do, or Lisa does, or Danny does, or Jamie does, or any of us. Salesforce says it this way: having viewpoints from employees with varied backgrounds reflects the communities we serve and helps us make better decisions. That's what this is about. I would suggest, and there's a book written about it, and I'm not even going to give you book titles today, and they're not included in it, is that I tried to learn how to view the fact that my number one customer, believe it or not, was my employees. At least it's your number one internal customer. But to jump on into the Gallup slide, just like it's written here, again, I admit that I have a bias towards strengths. The obvious thing is that employees are treated with respect. I think I would hope we would all agree that a culture of inclusiveness is rooted in respect. Lack of respect not only makes employees feel bad, but can lead to negative behaviors in the work environment. As a matter of fact, lack of respect most often correlates with discrimination and harassment reports. I'll point out to an earlier comment about make sure you know about microaggressions. Make sure your leaders know about microaggressions. It's so critical that people not use terms that express bias. Respect is in the eye of the beholder. I hope you understand what I mean by that. And this is a place that organizational mission and values are so important to lay the foundation for how respect should be demonstrated and what behaviors are not aligned with your company's culture. And again, I want to reiterate this, I'll probably reiterate it again somewhere, is that Gallup advances the finding that employee attitudes typically grow out of treatment by the direct supervisor. I just can't emphasize that too much. The first thing you got to do to treat somebody with respect is you got to get to know them. And people in your organization need to know you expect respect for team members so everyone feels comfortable, but also comfortable in being able to speak up and sharing new ideas without fear of being punished. That's that safe thing about what we're dealing with here. Employees need to feel like they can be their authentic selves. Organizations should be transparent about the types of behaviors that are encouraged and behaviors not tolerated. I know I just used the word behaviors not tolerated. Because you want employees to be themselves, but you want them to also uphold professionalism, and that's up to the organization. Now, this is what I call SID thing, a SID point, and I'll just make this point that if you're in a leadership role, you're a manager in a transit agency. My experience taught me over the years, they didn't tell me this when I graduate school, this is truly experience, that I needed 2 or 3 colleagues who could slam the door, tell me how dumb I am, and help dig me out of the mess I created. And then I also would say to you, and Lisa can laugh at this one because I did this back in Virginia Beach, is as a leader needs to have tentacles throughout the organization to know what's really going on. You need a mechanic that's willing to write you an email or a text message nobody knows about it, tells you what the crazy is going on. I call them moles in a hole. That's really a bad term to use, so don't anybody ever use that one. But I always wanted to have me a mole. That shows you my age, is they used to talk about people with moles that gave you information. But my point is simply this: treat people with respect. Make sure you know what's really going on. The second item that Gallup looks at is not being valued for your strengths. Now, the thing I want to pull out of here is valued. Have you ever noticed that the root word for evaluation is the same as valued? It's values. And evaluations, and I just point this out because I'm going to make this point a time or two. Evaluations, unfortunately, in my opinion, typically focus on weaknesses, or let's be polite and say on what you need to improve. Gallup is emphatic when it states that you improve through your strengths. You improve your weaknesses through your strengths. And I'll give you 3 sources to go to that I think are very powerful on this. One is the Gallup organization. They have several books on it. I think I've read everything they've written on it. I've tried to. Marcus Buckingham, who used to be with Gallup, now with Harvard Business Review. He's written about strengths-based leadership. Then there's a process that I love, but nobody in America wants to talk about. It came out of the United Kingdom, although it was founded in Chicago, called solutions focus. But to jump on from the fact that your strengths are critical to overcoming your weaknesses really is to improve. Inclusion on a team requires a combined influence of individuality, and here's that word, belongingness. Learning about personal strengths teaches employees about how they tend to think and behave, what motivates them, and what they naturally do best. Their strengths, as well as what may not come easily to them, and how they don't show respect for others. Notice how they don't show respect for others. Again, as a matter of fact, let me do it a different way. Most everybody's heard of Oprah Winfrey. So I would encourage you to go to YouTube, look up Marcus Buckingham's Strengths Finder interview with Oprah Winfrey. It is phenomenal to watch. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about. And you'll also see a lot of brilliance from both Marcus and from Oprah, but it is really great stuff. But what strengths-based development does, it's manifold, but one of the key things it does is helps organizations understand and develop each individual's natural talents. Self-awareness is so important to discuss who you are. Strengths-based development also helps teammates understand the value of each person to the team and creates a sense of interpersonal congruence. Everyone sees the individual as the individual sees themselves. Inclusion, a term that inclusion to me is pretty much synonymous with, is acceptance. Someone is liked or considered amiable by others. And acceptance is considered an antecedent to belonging. And I think that's part of the evolution I mentioned in the beginning. Where there's a sense of belongingness, employees are more connected with their work communities and are more likely to contribute and give extra effort. And they come more invested in the team's success. And this is the key point I'd like to think you hear. Learning about individual strengths contributes to belonging on the team and value to the team. If you know someone's strengths, for example, I know Lisa's strengths better than she thinks I does. And when we worked together, it was very helpful to me because she was phenomenal at what she did. Awareness of strengths also provides insight into our individual biases. You notice that word? Our individual biases. Inclusive teams realize something that we don't want to admit. Everyone has some level of bias. Unconscious biases, and they're the ones that we seem to have to really work on hard, are the mental shortcuts our minds take to make decisions based on social norms and stereotypes. They're fact of life and group dynamics. Biases can be grounded in a variety of factors such as race, gender, age, appearance, education, personality, and here's one I love: hometown or marital status. When these biases permeate the workplace through decisions made in favor of one group, these biases have a significant influence on people's attitudes, actions, and decisions. And I use an example, so I'm not using something race, gender, or preferences. I've seen people get jobs because of their hometown. You sit back, you apply for a job, you look and say, well, they're going to hire somebody from the hometown. I don't think that makes sense. Education, that's one that's used a lot. I could even tell you a story that would make you sick about a head of director personnel that once did it on appearance, and that was really sickening to deal with. When an employee's behavior negatively affects coworkers at a business, it cannot be ignored. I have to make that a point to you when it comes to strengths. The strengths-based approach can help organizations avoid spending time to develop employees into something they're not. How do you like that? And I'll go back to the comment that I made earlier, and I'd love to spend hours with you talking about that. And I would encourage every person listening, if you haven't done it, to go and take Gallup Strength Finder and identify your strengths and take a look at it. And if you ever wanted to go through the process, a more rigorous process, and simply reading a few pages and taking the Strengths Finder survey, I'd be happy to work with you to go through the process where you really dig down deep into yourself. And then you take the survey and see whether what you think and what the survey says, how they're congruent or incongruent. The third reason, and I need to hurry up here, I just looked at the clock, is leaders do what is right. One of the theses of what I tried to do as a leader and what I try to do in leadership training is to make this simple point, that the greatest challenge of leadership is doing the right thing just because it's the right thing. And I know how simplistic that sounds. Now, in my world, the term I would use is there be integrity in your leadership, because people who work with you have confidence, have faith even that you're going to do the right thing just because the right thing. And I'm gonna add this PS to it. This is not in my notes. In the political environment we operate in today, I think leaders are confronted time and time again with the fact of how they get compromised with what's going on in the political world. And those of you in transit, Lord knows what's going on politically. I would hate to be in your boots trying to make these kind of decisions. But employees must trust their managers and their organization. Trust is critical to an inclusive environment. And create a culture of inclusion is possible only with organizational structures that support and demonstrate diversity and inclusion practices. That's really just kind of looking at it in a simple way. But let me break it out as managers. Managers must be willing and able to facilitate conversations about diversity with transparency and compassion. Conversations that convey values on diversity and inclusion foster environments where employees can express themselves in a safe place. You notice safe place, and you're going to hear that again when we talk about ERGs. Managers can build an environment of trust through open discussions with employees about their differences and social identities. Managers, and this, what I'm going to say here is something I hope you hear. Managers should not, really, in my opinion, must not fear discussing tense issues related to inclusion with employees. And this is a quote out of Gallup, out of the article. Gallup research finds that employees are more likely to be engaged when they strongly agree that they can approach their manager with any question and talk to them about non-work related issues. I think that's a critical point for managers. As you notice, I've got in there non-work related issues. Gallup has that in there. So the simple point is managers need to keep lines of communication open and make sure that conversations make employees feel valued. Managers who struggle, this is me adding this on, managers who struggle with inclusive conversations need a mentor and a coach. If you work with me through my career, certainly in leadership training, you'd hear me talk about the 3 L's over the last 2 or 3 years since we've really been in the conversation about equity. I've added a 4th L, and I'm going to share with you a 5th L just so you know how it ties to equity. The L's, the 3 L's that I've preached, you might say, and talked a great deal about if you're a leader is to listen, to learn, and then lead. I've learned that if we're really going to carry out equity, we've got to add a 4th love, and y'all can laugh at me, it's okay. You've got to love. You have to love people. Most people are good. Most people mean well. Everyone wants respect. Everyone wants trust. And everyone wants you to see them for who they are as a natural one. So to me now, there are 4 L's. So whenever I talk about this with groups, they look at me with their eyes glazed over. When I add the 4th L, that you listen, you learn, you lead, and you do it through love. The 5th L that I want to share with you as a manager, and that is if you're doing this L, stop it today. And that is lip service. Because lip service to equity is like a vapor. People see through it automatically. It's going to fail you every time. But let's jump on to organizations. Managers, the organization. Organizations need to create structures to support diversity and inclusion, but they shouldn't be thought of as the end all. For example, I use an example, I don't offend anyone. A lot of people think that when they create a diversity office, they've dealt with diversity. That's the beginning. That's not where we're going. A few simple examples that I want to use that I'll point out, and I'll quickly run through them. If there are questions later, we can do it. Example would be just your selection and promotion processes. What are your job ads read? What are your interview questions? Who are your interviewers? What's the salary? Is that shown? What's your intentionality going in? A lot of times you have intentionality. I mentioned earlier David Thomas and the 2-tournament system. Tom Peters, who I'm showing my age again, in a book, Tom Peters is the one who kind of got the quote going, what gets measured gets done. And at least I hope it's okay to say, when we first talked about this, one of the things I kept telling Lisa is, let's go to equity audits. And I'm not trying to get you to equity audits, but I would say to you, when you look at what you're doing in your organization for trust, for these 3 L's, doing the right thing is, audit the problem in a sense of how diverse is your hiring funnel. For your current employees, how are they made up across genders, races, religions, region of origin? Just with a note, white candidates typically get more callbacks than black candidates with the exact same resume. That ain't right. How does it vary by department or job role? See, back to that supervisor thing. Across each of these facets, how have you allocated promotions? David Thomas. How is tenure varied? How does pay vary? The pay variation, folks, is a big, big deal. So to kind of close out this little section here on these 3 things, Gallup, and this is directly quoted, so I didn't want to in any way add any of my thoughts to it. Gallup evaluating culture. And this is what Gallup says in quote, when evaluating the inclusiveness of a culture, Gallup analyzes levels of trust in the company to be fair to all employees, number 1. Number 2, perceptions of supervisors, creating an environment that is trusting and open. And 3, confidence in an employer doing what is right when employees raise discrimination concerns. A question, and I'm going to close this section with this, in looking at employees are treated with respect, employees are valued for their strengths, leaders do what is right, and evaluating your culture and its inclusiveness, its belongingness. Have you ever done an organizational culture audit? If you haven't, I want to ask you to do something, and you can chuckle at me. And that is, get someone that you know well, that you trust, and you and that person just walk through your building. Just literally walk through your building and have each one of you take notes of what you see that depict what your culture is. And then sit down and talk about it. And I'll bet you saw 2 different things. And if you really want to do it, go ahead and get the race and gender diversity there and let you walk through the building and see what's said. And you're going to see, you might need to take a look at your culture, and you might need to go ahead and dig a little deeper into that. So let's just jump on. Is there anything we need to do here, Lisa? Nope. Let's jump on down to the next slide on the ERGs. Okay, this is a simple page where we collapsed a bunch together, and the article this comes from is in the about starting the ERGs. The article is in the resources, but I hope it, and at least I won't take a little time with this, but not a lot of time today, simply because I took so much time on belongingness over here on Gallup on those 3 items, because that's what an ERG is about. We've talked several times, Lisa mentioned even in hers in a different way, belongingness is tying Gallup across DEI. Now, I want to say to you, if you have an ERG or not, I know that a high enough percentage of you said that you had an internal advisory group. Many of you said that it was open to all. But there are 3 essentials, in my opinion. This is from just a lot of reading, and there are those of you who would add some and maybe change these. But the first essential, if you want to create an employee resource group, is leader support. The head, the manager needs to support it. 2, and I've talked about this a time or 2 today, it needs to be a safe place that conversations can be held and the employee doesn't have to fear a reprimand. And then the 3rd, and we've talked ad nauseum about that today probably, is trust. There has to be trust within the culture of the organization. Well, let me just add this to you. If you don't have an ERG, or I'll use the way the question is written, an internal advisory group, I'm going to tell you a secret. If you don't have your people talking where you're finding out what they're saying, your people are already talking. They're just talking down at the local bar or down at the coffee shop or wherever they go socially. And there's somebody in the group that's getting the group together down at the coffee shop. Might be Saturday morning, it might be Sunday morning, it might be whatever. But all I'm saying to you is the conversation is going on. There are 3 main types of ERGs that I want to just point out to you. And if you have questions, please put them there for us to talk about at the end if we have time. The first type of ERG is a social ERG, where you connect a group. And that is very, very common now. And I'm just going to say it, it's the most common group today that's emerging that wants a social ERG is the Lgbtqia community, and QIA plus community. And I share that with you because the conversation of sexual orientation. Now, I'll tell you one that I've had a little experience with from a distance experience, but it's with veterans needing to get together to have their conversations that go with it. The second time, I'm not going to belabor any of these as we go. You can see what's up there, and what I'm going to say fits this. The second type of ERG is an advocacy ERG. And that's an ERG that you want as a leader even, or that a group of employees come forward with that want to affect change. As a matter of fact, I'll share with you when Lisa and I began the conversation of putting together the Transit Equity Toolkit, our original conversation, and we changed it really late in our conversation and putting this together and reading resources. We were going to call this section not employee resource groups, we were going to call it an equity resource group. And that would fit under item number 2. And really item number 3, type number 3, I should say. And that's an external partnerships ERG. And that's where you're connecting out in the community. And now, type number 3, I'll point out to you, if you're the manager or you're the leader in the organization, this is a way that you can do a lot with brand building. You can do a lot with community building. You can do a lot with talent pipeline building. In other words, you can have sub goals from the organizational standpoint to connect out into the community. In my opinion, and this is truly my opinion, you need all 3. You need the social ERG to allow people that just want to get together socially to do it. And if you're going to start this thing, I'm going to break it down into 6, and then I got to quote 7th item, and then I'm going to jump on to the next thing. If you're going to start one, the first thing you need is a leader buy-in. If you're the manager of a transit agency, if you don't buy in, an ERG is going to struggle. So it takes leader buy-in. It obviously takes interest. But one of the points that I want to make, and I'll use the LGBTQIA plus community just for ease, is make the ERG not just exclusive to that group of people. Make it open to all who want to learn about the whole sexual orientation issue. If it's about equity, there may be a group, say, of 8 people in your organization who really want to do it, but there may be everybody. And quite frankly, everybody ought to be involved in the equity discussion, because that's where we learn about who we are, the natural self that we are. But the point is, you want to be sure there's enough interest, but also it's advisable to make it open to all. Then, of course, you define your goals and write a mission of what you're trying to do. You need to get an executive sponsor. And the executive sponsor means somebody out of what they call the E-suite. And I want to add, and hope your HR professionals aren't offended, it's advised that the executive sponsor not be from HR. Then, of course, you need to develop a business charter approved by, and I just put the question mark because different organizations, different transit agencies, it may be the manager, it may be HR, it may be the business. I don't know who it is. It may be, in many cases now, where people have created a diversity officer. The business charter for the ERG would be through the diversity officer. So I'll leave that to each one to describe. And then, of course, the 6th thing and last thing is to promote your ERG internally. The 7th thing that I always add is try to get a budget. And I won't use any numbers for you because I don't want to scare anybody to death. But one point I do want to make, and that if you're really serious about starting ERGs in your agency, or to go beyond the required internal advisory unit, I would encourage you to get involved with Diversity Inc. Their documents on how to start one dig really deep. That's particularly if you're the one that's the organizer or you're leading the conversation. The Diversity Inc. materials are really outstanding, and I would certainly recommend them to you. But I cannot, as I close the ERG thing, I encourage you to make sure that you create the means by which you can get good information. And I will say this to you from experience, the hardest job of doing the right thing, because it's the right thing, is your ability as the leader, whether you be the board or you be the manager or people that would be in the manager's office. The hardest thing you do in your job is getting good information. So I say to you, create every means by which you can get good information. So Lisa.
Sid, I wanted to reference the speaker that we had at our conference back in September at the opening session, Jacqueline Hopkins from SEPTA in Philadelphia. She was in the HR department, But she said that they started out in a non-threatening type of gathering where they would do a book club every month. And that was, they would pick some titles that would pose some interesting dilemmas for discussion. And if it's possible to hold the group during work hours, sometimes that's not possible, but that demonstrates that you believe it's important enough to commit, agency or company resources to do it on the clock. So those were some points she brought up.
Lisa, I would just add to it, I would just say to the group that if you really want to dig into equity, there are a lot of books you ought to read to be prepared to have this conversation and to be able to answer the questions that the people in your groups might have. So Lisa, you want to add anything else to that?
No, I'll talk some more about civic engagement when we get to that part. But I think right now, I don't know if you want to talk more about the community needs links, but we'll, after this, we'll ask some questions and then we'll go to talk about civic engagement and community mapping. Yeah.
Yeah, the main thing with community needs links, and the reason we included this is that in our at least in my conversations, we talked a great deal about what Link Houston has been doing. Obviously, what APTA has been doing. We had the privilege of Faith Walker spending time with us from RVA, and you'll see that we have that set of links there. Hampton Roads Transit, we added that their advisory committee, so you would see an idea of what I'll call as official through the agency. But you'll find in the resources, whether it's a community needs link, you'll see the first one listed as Lake Houston. You see the facilitation guide. What we try to do here is to provide with you some sample materials in the resources that you could use if you wanted to get out in your community. And I've said this many times today in several different ways. In my opinion, the best way to make transit highest value in your community is to get out there and talk to the people and find out what the real people are thinking. And that's what the community needs links are about.
Well, and Link Houston started out with an organization that was focused on, it was a charitable foundation focused on affordable housing. And they realized they couldn't talk about affordable housing without talking about transit. And so they created this, this whole organization and advisory organization to look at where transit needed to go and really put their weight behind improving transit in Houston, have a very strong relationship with the transit agency there. And I think that they've got some great tips from the grassroots forward. So I would urge everybody to take a look at what they were able to do, because it did. Houston is not a city that was known for public transportation. It's a huge sprawling city that is automobile centric, and they attempted to turn some of that around. So anyway, some good information there. So so let's go now, Danny, to our next set of poll questions, please. This one's on ridership and advisories. Does your agency have a ridership advisory group? Beyond that, does your agency have community outreach activities? Please indicate sources of engagement for your agency. Housing advocates, faith groups, social justice groups, environmental organizations, civic such as Rotary, Kiwanis, Ruritan, neighborhood organizations, and finally, business organizations such as the Chamber of Commerce or Greater Washington Partnership or other transit advocacy organizations. Please check all that apply. Okay.
All right. We're about to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And 73% of our do not have a ridership advisory group. Beyond that, 95% do some community outreach. And with the most reaching out to chambers or transit or transportation advocacy organizations.
Okay. All right, so we do have outreach into the community. One of the things, Danny, if you could advance to the civic engagement list. This is brainstorming on organizations that we know to be active in Virginia, some of them stronger in certain areas of the state than others. But everybody has some aspect of a faith community and their concerns about their members' access to essential services. Environmental organizations have been very strong in support of transit. Certainly organizations such as Equity Focus, such as NAACP. And then of course we've got employer health focused organizations like Enrichment. And we have the hospitals, our partners on the Pulse. So this is just to help you take an inward look at what organizations matter in your community. And in the resources that we've listed in the toolkit, there's a couple of different sheets in there about community mapping, or sometimes it's called power mapping. It's a process of gathering important and relevant information about your community and taking a look at how you can build a support base through engagement and outreach in the community. It will help you determine who you have relationships with and maybe where you need to focus to build stronger relationships, and inclusion in planning for expanding or strengthening transit. So think about, in your case, determine who should be involved in the community mapping process. Who on your staff or on your board could help you with this. Begin with some of these that you already know and have a relationship with, and think about who else matters in your community, who helps get things done in your community. If you think about there's a proposal for a new development or a new, I don't know, a new policy that is being considered by your governing body in your locality, who weighs in, who makes a difference there, and then figure out who do you need to talk to. What is your, if you think about it in terms of concentric circles, with the decision being in the middle and your spheres of influence moving out, think about how you can bring those people together to support what you're trying to do, and also provide input as to what's needed and maybe where your routes need to go, and you know, to really have your finger on the pulse of the community. So anyway, I hope this will be useful to you. And I would also ask you to think about who's not on this list. Who are we not including? And please email me and let me know so that we can continue to update this and make this relevant for all our communities across the state. All right, we're going to move on to strategic planning.
Okay, Lisa, I'm gonna give myself 1 minute. I went way over time before. On strategic planning, I just want to simply point out to you that the conversation that Lisa and I talked about is what's generally referred to as aspirational goals. I encourage you to read the article by Mead and Hunt. It's 2 pages, so it's not a long read. But I just want to, 2 points from that article is all I want to say. And then I want to talk about aspirational goals quickly. In transportation planning, we typically design for demand rather than the world we want to see. That's oversimplifying. Aspirational goals is something that, I'll just make this my opinion, that the requirements for your strategic plans and your TDPs isn't really about. So what our conversations have been about, and I'm gonna make this real simple and stop, is if you could sit back and not have to think about budget, not to think about the regulations, how the money flows. What do you really want your agency to be known as or known for? I mean, what would be, I'm going to use a term that comes out of the United Kingdom. What would be your dream agency? What would it be if you looked at 5 years from now, you're the leader, what would your agency be? And if anyone ever wanted to work on that, that's something I've done many times with boards, and have watched the master do it back over the years. And I've tried to learn from him. But the question is, with strategic planning, is take a moment, pause, and go beyond what's mandated and think about anticipatory goals. You can Google anticipatory goals and find lots of articles on it. So Lisa, Danny, I'm just going to jump on just so I don't get
before you leave strategic planning, I need to mention that we would have included DRPT because we do have a strategic planning guideline policy in the state, as well as transit other TDP plans for our transit agencies. But as many of you know, the DRPT site has been down for a while now because of different technical and other hacking issues here. So that link is not available, but it will be on our Toolkit mapping, the live link on that. Also, I would call attention to the Kimberly Horn training that was offered at our conference, and the recording of that is on our website. So, so we'll continue to update this as the links are restored. Okay, thank you, Sid.
Oh, good, thank you. Okay, we're over at communications.
We have we have a polls.
Yep, I'm sorry. Yep, take it away, Danny.
Oh, okay. And this is, I believe, Lisa, the last poll.
It is, yes. Okay, has your agency worked to include equity considerations in your strategic planning or TDP? What are the top priorities for more equitable transit service in your agency? Pick 2. More bus shelters, more service frequency, more service coverage, more sidewalks and bike stands, enhanced safety, security features, or other. Okay.
Okay. We'll close down the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 81% of respondents do have equity considerations in their strategic plan.
Good.
And it appears that more service frequency and more service coverage are top 2 priorities for equitable transit service.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Now we're going to take a look at communications. We hope that you will, as you develop more of your equity initiatives at your agency or things that you're doing that you want to shine some light on, that you are putting this out through social media, in your emails to your riders and flyers, whatever your communications techniques are at your agency. We have a graphic designer, and some of these graphics courtesy of GRTC, so shout out to them, that we're making available to you to use any of these, and they are in the toolkit, and some of them are perfectly sized for Instagram, some for Twitter, some for Facebook, and some for print copy. So you're welcome to use anything that's on there to make it your own. All right, and this is the final list of resources here. Sid, anything else you want to say about this?
Just simply what we try to do is put a list of the essential people that you deal with we added to it, I added to it the National League of Cities because of it, resolutions and things dealing with equity. And again, I just reiterate, I hope you'll get familiar with Diversity Inc. because I think they're important to the conversation going on with equity. That would be it, at least.
Okay. And before I offer my closing comments, I would urge you now to put any questions you may have into the Q&A box feature at the bottom of your screen. And we have a few minutes now that we can answer those questions. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on that. But also just want to tell you that all of this and more will be in the Transit Equity Toolkit. It's already on our website, and it will live on the VTA website. It won't always be on the homepage, but it will be available. And as it's updated, we'll continue to put those updates there as well. We encourage you to use it, and even posting the image on your own website or continue to link to it as we continue our work on outreach on equity. So we encourage your feedback and suggestions, and willing to journey with you on this adventure. If this is new to you, or if you need additional maybe some tips, some advice of where to go on some next steps, we're happy to respond to you. So anyway, we're here to serve as a resource for you. So anyway, we are at the Q&A section. I don't see any Q&As. So we'll wait another minute. In the meanwhile, thank you, Sid, and I thank the audience for your poll responses. We'll give them another minute, see if there's any Q&As.
Yeah, please, I just want to just add, I appreciate those who chose to be with us today. To just take time to listen to what we're talking about, and thank you for your interest in. Really appreciate your energy for the whole diversity, equity, inclusion, I like to say belonging initiative is going on in America. I doubt there's anything more important than this right now to who we are as a people. So thank you for your leadership and your work on this.
Okay, well, that is going to wrap up today's webinar, and we want to thank everybody again for joining us. And just to let you know that our next online event will be our legislative briefing on Monday, January 24th at 10 a.m. Once again, we're conducting our briefing virtually because of COVID considerations. We will be sending out the Zoom invitation soon, but go ahead and mark your calendars now for that. And even jumping ahead for that, we'll be talking more about equity, among other topics, at our next annual conference, which will be back in the spring framework here, or late spring. It will be June 1st and 2nd in Roanoke, Virginia. So mark your calendars for that. So I'm checking one more time. There's no Q&A, so I think we're ready to sign off. So again, thanks everybody. And we're here if you need us. Bye-bye.
Happy New Year.